Hello and welcome to David's Politics Show. In the popular recollection of the Second World War, the month of December 1941 is associated almost exclusively with what Roosevelt famously termed the date that will live in infamy, namely the 7th of December, Pearl Harbor. Yet a mere 4 days later, another momentous event took place, which would see the war take on a whole new dimension and a truly global scale. On the 11th of December, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. Why did he do that? Was he driven already in late 41 by an apocalyptic vision of his role in history? Was the decision, in other words, totally irrational? Or can the sources of this fateful decision, on the contrary, be located in the German dictator's understanding of several complex interrelated spheres, economic, political, and military, and in his general sense of how the war was proceeding at the time? That is a task my guest today set himself in writing Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation, Why Germany Declared War on the United States. Dr. Klaus Schmider earned his doctorate at the University of Mainz and has been on the staff of the War Studies Department of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst since 1999. In 2007, he co-authored Volume 8 of the Official German History of the Second World War. Klaus, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
A pleasure and an honor.
So, Klaus, I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the historiography, which is the subject of your introductory chapter. It's very interesting because, of course, this is one of the fateful turning points in the Second World War. So, of course, historians have tried to make sense of this decision, which at first sight does seem somewhat inexplicable, certainly with the benefit of hindsight, of course. But that's the task of the historian, to understand things as they were at the time. And the historiography has had sort of several historians kind of chime in. Andreas Hillgruber was one of the first to maybe put forward his understanding of Hitler's decision, but then also Gerhard Weinberg, who was kind of the doyen of World War II studies, at least for a preceding generation, perhaps, and Eberhard Jäckel and others. So I'd like you to kind of, if you could, for our audience, give us a sense of how historians have understood this decision, and how you wanted to position your contribution as against this backdrop, and why you felt there was a need to re-examine this incredibly important turning point in the Second World War.
Well, think of it in terms of a similar decision that is incredibly well covered in historiography.
Mm-hmm.
The run-up of the decision to invade the USSR by Nazi Germany
mm-hmm.
has been covered in, well, I dare say probably hundreds of monographs, unpublished PhDs, articles, conference proceedings. You could fill a medium-sized library.
Yeah.
With you could say the intellectual fruits of that discussion. By comparison, what is an equally important, equally momentous decision 6 months later,
mm-hmm.
certainly in the English language, as far as I can tell, there are 3 articles, and not very long ones either. And
which is striking.
No, it's not striking. The word you're looking for is scandalous.
Okay.
No, it is, because if you allow for the fact that all universities, to greater or less extent in the US, granted, but to greater or less extent, universities depend on taxpayers' money,
mm-hmm.
public money, you'd expect a more conscientious approach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's like the few people who made at least a half-serious attempt to engage with the subject found like one piece of evidence and then pocketed it, muttered something along the lines of, well, that's good enough for government work, and then went on their way.
Mm.
And it was a bit more complicated than that. For instance, Gerd Weinberg makes the point that and I think he's right. I've not found a document to bear it out, but I think he's right that one of the reasons that pushed Germany into this alliance was the Japanese surface navy, which he felt would do an awful lot to draw away Anglo-American strength from the European and Middle Eastern theaters of war. And on that, he's right. I mean, if you allow for the fact that the French fleet at the time was largely demobilized, the Japanese Navy is the third largest on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
So that is not exactly, you could say, irrelevant, but it's not the whole story. And by itself, it would never have sufficed to explain such a decision. It's just that nobody wanted to take in the big picture. I put it down to the fact that these gentlemen were not military historians. We often think of them in these terms, but they're not. They are historians of international relations. They are historians of World War II. They're historians of the Third Reich, but they're not military historians. And that's why none of them were willing to approach it in such a way that on the one hand, you give equal billing to high-level discussions between German and Japanese diplomats, while at the same time also engaging with problems of German aircraft design around the time.
Right.
It's all part of the same package.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's one of the things your book does so well. I mean, it examines so many different aspects, which of course is what you have to do, because I mean, that's what Hitler had in his mind, right? I mean, he was the dictator of the Third Reich at the time. He had all these different balls in the air, and he was making his calculus. And one of the things I'd like to stress, just for the audience, that I think is so valuable about your contribution, is that the tendency and the kind of the temptation, I'm almost tempted to say that the temptation, right, is to look at this, of course, like I said, with the benefit of hindsight, in retrospect, and basically, explain it away as yet another kind of symptom of Hitler being, to simplify things, kind of a crazy dude, right? Because of course, in retrospect, it's so obviously a suicidal move, right? Why would you take on the U.S.? The U.S. is a continental power, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't reach it with your current technology. You can't reach it, whereas they can, they have England as a kind of the UK as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and et cetera, et cetera. So the temptation is to explain it away that way. But what you're trying to do is to, actually, in a certain sense, take Hitler seriously, right? Take him seriously as a politician.
I like to think I've just done that. I've never have I believed in this theory of Hitler in 41 or in 42 being hell-bent of self-immolating. Because he realizes, oh my God, I've overplayed my hand. This is going down in the most spectacular fashion, but at least I want to be the choreographer of my own demise. And I'm sorry that it's poppycock. I mean, that's nonsense. I mean, there's not a shred of evidence to indicate that. There is one particular statement from late November 1941, which appears to indicate such a train of thought, but it's always taken out of context. The people who used that quotation, he articulated it in conversation with another Axis diplomat, another Axis dignitary, never give you the full quotation. They do not include the sentences that came before and after the key quotation. And if you do that, they give a completely different spin on what he was trying to say. In November 1941, he's got an army group parked outside Moscow. He's not thinking of this war in terms of defeat, stalemate, the need to choreograph your own demise. That comes later. That comes in February, March 1945. But definitely not in the autumn of 1941. 1941, if you had shoved a copy of Robert Harris's counterfactual novel Fatherland in his face, he would have said, yeah, I recognize that. That's essentially what the new Europe is going to look like. That's what I'm busy building.
Right, right, and it's going relatively well, as far as
and it's actually going rather well. Yes, right. Absolutely. So, I mean, in contrast to the Japanese, that's where you could say that's the key distinction I make between the German and Japanese imperialists, is that if you want to be a cynic, you can actually make the argument that their hubris sort of makes German actions intelligible, because the Germans actually go from victory to victory to victory. And in each case, the latest victory is achieved against even more amazing odds than in the previous case.
Right.
It's like they have found the philosopher's stone of land warfare. Mm-hmm. The Japanese, on the other hand, have been given a drubbing by the Russians in 1939 and are dealing with 5 years of stalemated war in China. And it's on top of that they want to challenge the British Empire and the United States.
And China is barely a functioning state. So
exactly. And China is barely a functioning state, and Soviet Russia is a state they look down on. So if you get a drubbing from people like that, does it make sense to challenge the United States?
Right.
So I would put to you that, if anything, if we're talking crazy people here, it's not Adolf Hitler. It's the collection of Japanese militarists in Tokyo.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting way to think about it. And we'll come to the politics in Tokyo, because those are absolutely fascinating. But as you said, the apocalyptic nihilism does eventually come, of course, but it comes later, much later. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to his understanding of the U.S. That this has interestingly been the subject of several recent monographs. There's the book by Brendan Sims, who incidentally also has a very nice blurb on the back cover of your book, and you have a fascinating chapter in which you, in exhaustive detail, look at what did Hitler actually know about the U.S. Right? I mean, this is a guy who obviously he had never been there. As far as I know, he didn't really speak any English. Or maybe very little, but he did have some interactions with Americans, especially of German-speaking Americans, or Americans of German descent, let's say, in the First World War, and he did have some people around him, including in the Wehrmacht, who did know something about the U.S., who had actually been there and had, in fact, were relatively familiar with American industrial and military capacity, etc. So give us a sense of where is he getting his ideas from as far as the U.S. concerned? What does he know about this country, and what are people telling him?
He starts out with a positive view. I mean, there's an overabundance of evidence to that end, whether it is volume 2 of Mein Kampf, whether it is the speeches he delivered pre-1939, whether it is the notes taken during the coffee sessions at Führer's headquarters, the memoirs from assorted hangers-on published after the war. There is a big overarching theme that he is impressed by not just the sheer size of the US, but what they have made of it.
Right.
He is impressed by the economies of scale, which have put their industries in a position to, completely elbow aside the competition. And in tandem with this, he also feels that this is a country which is still ruled by good racial stock. That's important to him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, let's face it. I mean, if you look at the photo album of the gentleman and maybe I think one or two ladies who sat in both houses of Congress in the 30s and 40s, they're all white. And that's something he approves of. He approves of the racist legislation which is passed in the 1920s to block further immigration from the Far East. This is something which he notes and which he approves of. I dare say approves of very heartily. And again, that is a matter of record. This should not, however, this is very important, this should not be confused with a sort of starry-eyed view of the world, as in these people are our natural friends.
Right. On the contrary,
he does see them as a natural rival and competitor and possibly enemy. He at no point, I mean, I've not found a single shred of evidence that might, at any point, that might point to any illusions on his part that you might one day be, I don't know, turn this country into a friendly ally or something. That's simply not the case. I would dare say that throughout most of this period of time, he sees them as the aspiring superpower he will probably have to share the planet with. But he is impressed. He's impressed with their economy, and he's impressed by their technological feats. The most important thing to note here is that this enthusiasm, I wouldn't really shy away from describing it as enthusiastic. It does not even take a dent with the onset of the Great Depression.
Interesting.
Speeches, and we're talking about speeches that were given in different settings, whether to the party faithful, to a few Gauleiters, a dozen company CEOs. It doesn't really matter. In all these, you always get this same recurring theme. And even as the US is buffeted by the Great Depression, he is still, in a manner of speaking, keeping the faith,
right?
Which is interesting.
Absolutely, and one of the things you mentioned, which really caught my attention, is he notices the fact, and approvingly, that despite the Great Depression, there is no socialist party in the United States.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Which is like his big bête noire in Germany.
There is a very brief moment in time. There's a very brief moment in time around the time of the so-called Roosevelt Depression of 37-38, and economists or economic historians to this day are still debating why it occurred when it did, where he appears to waver. There we do have one or two sources that indicate that at this point he really feels like, oh my God, they've really done it this time. Will they really go socialist after this? But it doesn't last.
Right. Yeah. There's labor unrest, but there never emerges a proper socialist party like in Europe.
So and it doesn't last. But that's something that does startle him, that does surprise him. And there's also a memorandum which reaches him from the US by a German emigre, a former diplomat turned gentleman farmer, who makes some very dire predictions, which appear to have influenced him for at least a couple of months. But then this is very quickly shelved.
Right. And one thing which was also very interesting is, and again, kind of contributes to this, rounded portrait of Hitler that you give in the book, and not someone who was, only interested in military matters, for instance. He's very much fascinated by, for example, American autos, right?
Yeah.
And their general capacity to innovate, to be very industrious. He probably connects this also with the racial elements, like you were mentioning earlier. And he's concerned that eventually, at some point, America will be able to produce so much, it will just dump its products on essentially Europe, and he's concerned about that.
Yeah, the auto industry is a particular concern of his. Yes, absolutely. I mean, both in the sense that he wants to bring forward the motorization of Germany, which at the time is still lagging badly behind. This is not the Germany of the 1960s with Volkswagen Beetles crawling over every motorway. Right. So very different. There's still a Germany of the early 30s is still a very different place in this regard. And he's both starstruck. He's starstruck by the output of the American auto industry, but also, yes, concerned. Concerned that these guys will one day simply completely swamp the European markets. It's true.
Right. Now, tell us a little bit about the generals around him who had been to the U.S. and who knew a little bit about the pre-war, pre-Marshall U.S. Army. What kind of, because that's one of the explanations, right? That's given is that basically he completely underestimated American military power, and he doesn't. So tell us about
which is the ultimate paradox. I mean, his first Secretary of War. Oh dear me, I'm having a very senior moment here. It'll come to me. In 32-33 did an extended visit accompanied by another fellow officer. They toured West Point and a number of other military training facilities. And with the exception of West Point, which was described as, quote, antediluvian, their opinion, not mine,
right.
They were left with the sensation that this is by and large a people that will allow itself to be led, that should the need arise and should the American government ever tell the male half of the population, gentlemen, fall in, it likely is not will happen, that this is supported by cultural attitudes, and that at least a sort of, shall we say, skeleton of training facilities is ready and waiting to turn them into a mass army. The key thing is that unlike other advisors or other reports that reached him that came with a clear agenda to tell him, on no account must you get into any sort of confrontation with the US. The reports that came out of this trip were kept in a very neutral tone. And that's what he appreciated.
Right.
There were others who came afterwards that arguably I would put to you, had less of an impact because they presumed to tell him, listen, don't do this. Okay, don't even think of going there. And that really tended to put his back up.
Yeah, he didn't like it when people limited his options.
Yeah, exactly.
This was, I think, General von Blomberg, one of the...
yes, correct.
He was one of the early kind of leaders of the Wehrmacht, right? When Hitler took power in 1933. Okay, let's move on now to the other protagonist of the story, which is Japan. Right now, here too, it's fascinating to go and read about what Hitler knew about this country on the other side of the world. Where did he get his information from? Interestingly, Japan had sided with the Entente in the First World War, right? So you'd think there might be some resentment about that, but you argue that it's actually hard to find any.
No, he was quite pragmatic there. He was happy to let bygones be bygones,
right.
And I assume it's partly to do with the fact that he didn't hanker after the lost South Sea colonies. It's just not something which touched, you could say, a string with him. He always wanted territorial expansion, but in a completely different direction. So the Japanese were welcome to their loot as far as he was concerned. His sources of information are certainly far more limited. Okay, yeah, he would have had a far easier time gaining access to either media products or books or to travelers who had recently returned from a trip to the US than the same thing with regards to Japan. Even in the globalized world of the 1930s, Japan was not just geographically more distant from Germany than the US. She was also culturally a lot more distant from Germany. So getting the latest news, that information that went beyond, you could say, the bare bones of press coverage, would have been more difficult. A bit more of a challenge, and needless to say, the nature of Japanese politics of the time made it, I dare say, 10 times more challenging anyway.
Right. Yes. And you mentioned in the book that Japan really kind of pops up on his radar when they walked out of the League of Nations after their invasion.
That's the first time.
Right, after the invasion of Manchuria, and he actually then I think in 1936, I believe, recognizes the puppet state they create there, the Manchukuo. And he's, like you said, he sees Germany's victories against the European colonial powers then when the war does start as opening the door to Japanese expansionism in Southeast Asia, which, like you said, he doesn't really mind because he's not a kind of 19th century colonialist, as it were, right? He doesn't really care about these like tiny little islands or whatever, or even in Africa. He's not concerned about that. He's looking east the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. In the case of Manchuria, it really, and again, I have to stress that we don't have a paper trail as impressive and as multi-layered as we do with regards to relations with the US. But what we do have indicates that the invasion of Manchuria, and let's not forget, 1931 was limited to southern Manchuria at first, but that does not have registered as with him. That didn't make that big a splash. It's the scandal of Japan actually walking out on the League.
Right.
That really got his attention. That must have been the first time where he told his ADC, take a note, Japan, possible fellow revisionist power, ? Not before. But you can make too much of him being swept off his feet by an alleged infatuation with, I don't know, Japanese warrior samurai culture or the like. I would put to you that as the two grew closer and closer and closer, this was a wholly pragmatic process. And if the British, say, had offered peace on September 29th, 1940, and had made it conditional about Germany scrapping the treaty with Japan she had just signed 48 hours earlier, he would have done it. He would have done it in the blink of an eye. Right.
That's very, very interesting counterfactual. So maybe for the audience, let's go into that a little bit. So in September 1940, the Germany, Japan, and fascist Italy signed the Tripartite Pact. Now, it's interesting. It's very important to remember in relation to then what happens after Pearl Harbor, that the Tripartite Pact did not commit Germany to join Japan in an offensive war, right?
Yeah.
Not that Hitler was, held legal, was kind of venerated the sanctity of legal treaties at any point in his career, but he was not bound by the pact to do that, right? So there's that, and there's the coda to that, or the kind of the parenthesis on the other end is the signing of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in April of 41, which is striking when you think about it, because after all, these two empires are theoretically in a kind of defensive alliance, but you argue in the book that Hitler didn't mind, may even have welcomed such a pact. So tell us about that.
No, he was a bit still. He was not yet set on a course of action. I'm convinced that he did not have a war with the U.S. in mind. He didn't. He would not, even at the time. He was still aiming to avoid war with the U.S. There's about a fortnight after the signing of Lend-Lease where he changes his tune, but his exasperation over that surprise actually wears off remarkably quickly. And he is on record as saying that, well, if the Russians and the Japanese bury the hatchet, that might actually give the Japanese an incentive to turn their gaze towards Singapore. And for us, that's a good thing. Reinforcements that might otherwise have flowed in the direction of North Africa will have to be redirected to the Far East. But there's no mention of the United States in this context.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting. He's thinking about it in, like you said, in terms of Singapore, in terms of British colonial possessions there. He's also thinking very interestingly about rubber, to which you dedicate a whole chapter in the book, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. It's striking how much he knew about these things. He
would have known a lot about it for two reasons. Out of necessity. He would have known a lot more about substitute production than any other head of state at the time, because Germany, apart from coal, doesn't have any raw materials. And that means that you could say German industry is roped in to produce substitutes. That goes for clothes and that goes for rubber. And synthetic rubber is a possibility. The Germans are not the only ones to produce it. So do the Soviets. The German product is slightly superior in quality, but it can't be used, for instance, for aircraft tires. The British and the Americans are pretty blasé about this, and they look on, we say, in a sort of, why should that even concern me kind of fashion. Because 90 to 95% of the world's rubber is produced in a small cluster of colonies and protectorates in Southeast Asia. Production in Malaya and then the Dutch East Indies took off in such a spectacular way in the 1910s and 1920s that the Brazilian and African competition was basically wiped out. They are just left with niche of the market. Now, he also knows an awful lot about the ins and outs of Far Eastern rubber production through his dealings with Walter Hevel. Walter Hevel is a young Nazi of the first hour who is the point man of the German Foreign Office at Führer's headquarters. And he often regales Hitler and his retinue with his tales of the years he spent as a plantation manager in the Dutch East Indies. He knows an awful lot about the place. He knows things like there is this one tree which is responsible for most of rubber production. You can get rubber from other plants, but mostly it's going to be Hevea brasiliensis, which is the classic rubber tree, but which needs 5 to 7 years to mature, which means that if by some lucky break all of Southeast Asia were to disappear down a crack in the universe, the Allies can't just improvise, you could say, a new rubber industry out of thin air in, say, I don't know, Cuba, because these things take 5 to 7 years to mature. You can't tap them safely before that.
Right.
And that is really a singular strategic vulnerability for the United States of America, one that was not sufficiently appreciated at the time. It's not like the American government and its armed forces felt that the Japanese could not help themselves to the Dutch East Indies. But some contemporary comments indicate that pre-Pearl Harbor, they are under the impression that if the Japanese were to have the temerity, we would just have to kick them out again. And yeah, we would lose the Dutch East Indies for half a year, and guess what? By spring they will be back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nobody anticipated a situation where like 90% of the rubber-producing colonies or territories of the planet would end up in Japanese hands for like 4.5 years. That seemed like preposterous.
Right. Yeah. No, and it's striking that, again, this is one of the things he has in mind in December 41. Right. He doesn't think the Americans will be able to get their hands on enough rubber, at least by the point in time which would be relevant. Right. Maybe a year and a half, 2 years later. So that's something he also has in his mind. So let's look a little bit now at how the kind of gradual acceleration of the or intensification of the friction between Nazi Germany and the U.S. comes about. Now, the critical pieces of legislation in this regard are cash and carry on the one hand, and later Lend-Lease. So give us a sense, and because again here it's very interesting the extent to which Hitler comes off as very prescient and actually more alive to the dangers of, for instance, Lend-Lease than many of his own diplomats were, including the diplomats in the U.S. Right. So tell us a little bit about how kind of the three neutrality acts and Lend-Lease start to kind of push the U.S. and the Third Reich closer and closer to conflict.
Well, the Lend-Lease Act, of course, is the result of Britain approaching bankruptcy. And the US president, who is, of course, under considerable pressure not to gift reams and reams and reams of military equipment to somebody who might no longer even be in a position to put it to best use, rather retain it for your own rearmament, he comes up with his genius idea. Well, guess what? It's not like we're gifting anything to anybody. We're just leasing it. You could say we're loaning it, and they will, in due course, return it. Now, it goes without saying that anybody even remotely conversant with military affairs knew perfectly well that this was a pipe dream. They knew that this particular tank or plane, likely or not, would never come back. Right. Or if it came back, it would come back in such a state that it would essentially no longer be fit for reintegration into the United States Armed Forces. But it allowed the president to control the discussion, because the public discussion had always reverted back to the World War I precedent, where American help mostly came in the form of cash. Cash, which in many cases then was either not repaid or repaid late. And that caused considerable exasperation and became quite a burden in the political hot potato in the interwar years. Now, rather than just doling out cash, the United States is sending weapons. Well, for starters, this is going to keep American business alive and well, and it's going to safeguard American jobs. So what's not to like there, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, the idea is that you will get paid. You will get either the gear you're sending over will be returned, or you will receive payment in kind, which is in fact what happened in due course. You're absolutely right in pointing out that Hitler, this country bumpkin, was far more alive to the threat posed by Lend-Lease than many of his career diplomats, than the embassy staff in Washington, who were far more blasé, who tended to take much more of a short-term view, as in, oh, American industry isn't up to much, and it will be at least 8 months before they can deliver X, Y, or Z. And he was apparently prepared to think beyond those 8 months.
Right.
Well, they weren't. But the real clincher are the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts, if you look at 70 years of historiography, the Neutrality Acts have been overshadowed both by Lend-Lease and by the Destroyer for Bases deal of September 1940. The Neutrality Acts are more difficult to visualize.
Mm-hmm.
The Destroyer for Bases deal you can visualize. It basically means, I mean, as you quite rightly say, there were several Neutrality Acts. For instance, one was passed during the Spanish Civil War, which forbade either the shipment of American arms. It forbade American merchantmen from traveling into a defined war zone. It forbade American citizens from serving as volunteers in a particular conflict. And a Neutrality Act was of course also passed upon the outbreak of World War II in Europe. And it proved to be the devil's own job to gradually dismantle it. From September 39 to September 41, no American merchantman was allowed to even approach Britain or her colonies. They could not take their cargoes there. The British might pay, either pay for, shall we say, 50 tanks, or then receive them through Lend-Lease. That still begged the question of how you're going to get them either to the theater of war in Egypt or to Britain herself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was rightly, I feel, felt that the moment the Americans dismantled the key provision in the Neutrality Act that allowed American merchantmen to sail straight into a British port, you would get a situation where sooner or later American merchantmen would be sunk by German U-boats. And before you know it, even the odd American passenger liner who had also taken to recross the North Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, there you have a precedent in 1915 and 1917, how Germany found herself thrust into war with the US.
Yeah.
And it was a correct assessment. The American Navy, in tandem with what we've been discussing so far, also started to escort a number of British convoys only halfway across the Atlantic, not more.
Mm-hmm.
But it was clear to everybody that they were crossing into a German war zone as they did so. And 3 American vessels were torpedoed in the course of these operations, and one of them even sunk with very heavy loss of life.
Right.
As luck would have it, it very nearly didn't come this way. It very nearly the opposite happened. This turned out to be a gradual escalation. In the first engagement, both belligerents missed. The second engagement, there was some loss of life. The third engagement was again a successful torpedoing of an oiler this time, a US Navy oiler this time. But again, no lives were lost. And then at the very end, you get the sinking of a destroyer with heavy loss of life. And this allowed the American public to get inured to this shooting war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There was no Pearl Harbor moment, though there very nearly was on June 20th. And this means that this becomes the new normal. On the other hand, it's remarkable how, you could say, how nervous a reaction you can get from American congressmen and American senators every time an American merchantman stops a torpedo. even when it's abundantly clear that it was traveling in a war zone and that it had war goods for the British on board. But somehow, a merchantman, that's civilians, we can't have that. Mm-hmm. And on one occasion, it actually it saves Roosevelt during fairly dicey votes in both houses of Congress. At the very last minute, the news comes over the wire that another American merchantman has been torpedoed. It's not quite clear where exactly and how many lives were lost, but as a result, the ranks are closed and the vote is won by the government. Mm-hmm. But it was a fairly close one. Now, the key thing is, of course, the last provision of the Neutrality Act, which basically says, crucially, that American merchantmen must not enter British ports. Mm-hmm. And that falls on November, another senior moment. I'm pretty sure it was November 13th. And Hitler himself had said 2 years before that when this falls, we can count on the Americans coming into the war in, I don't know, another 5 to 6 months.
Mm-hmm. Right. So he sees it as being ultimately inevitable, in other words.
Or something dangerously close to inevitable. What I find rather remarkable that none of my predecessors picked up on this. It's not like I had to upsile down the facade of a KGB archive in Siberia to find this document. It's even available in an edition. He said as much 2 years before. This is the ultimate tripwire. I mean, when this happens, then we're really in deep doo-doo. Then we really have to brace ourselves for impact. And this then bizarrely coincides in a matter of days with the Japanese offer of a military alliance. It's serendipity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Fascinating. Let me turn now, because I'm conscious of time, to one of the central chapters in the book. Perhaps the most important, in fact, in terms of how he's thinking about it, and which is, of course, the chapter on Barbarossa. Mm-hmm. And so let me kind of try and give a very sort of quick potted history of where we are in December 1941. So in late August of 41, Hitler has already come to the conclusion, despite the dramatic victories that have happened, entire encirclements, and millions of Soviet soldiers have been captured as prisoners of war, or entire tank armies have been destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. But Hitler basically comes to the conclusion that very likely the war will stretch into 1942. He takes that prospect on with a certain amount of equanimity. He's not particularly concerned. He basically thinks that the Soviet Union is on its hind legs, may be throwing its very last reserves into the fight, but it's maybe not going exactly according to plan, but basically they're more or less on track. Army Group North reaches Leningrad on the 8th of September, and until early December, Hitler is still willing to redirect some resources to the Northern Front, which is not, in fact, the central part of the front at that stage in the war, which goes to show he's not particularly concerned about things going on elsewhere. And now this is where we have to really, it's a little bit like the July crisis, right? 1942. We really have to look at the actual days, because the Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, fails around the 5th or 6th of December, something like that. Pearl Harbor is on the 7th, and he declares war on the United States on the 11th, right?
Correct.
So, and Army Group Center is about to get hit on the head in a very dramatic way by the Soviet counterstrike a couple of days later. So give us a kind of a sense of this dramatic timeline, which could almost be a movie. I mean, it's just incredibly dramatic. And situate for us the decision in and around the 11th in relation to what's going on before, and what he still doesn't know about what will happen a week, less than a week later.
Well, the key thing to realize is that the Soviet winter offensive outside Moscow is a very atypical Soviet offensive. Just about, with one possible exception that comes to mind, every single book on the subject, whether it's monographs on Barbarossa or monographs on the Battle of Moscow or biographies of Hitler, biographies of Stalin, they all state, or at least imply very strongly, that on the day in question, and some of them pick December 5th, others December 6th, the Red Army flung 100 divisions at the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not true. If you follow this back to its origins, you will discover that it was a Red Army communique from December 14th,
Mm-hmm.
which was their first official, shall we say, public political commitment to the success of this offensive. Prior to that, certainly for the first 7 days, you have localized attacks, which, don't get me wrong, this is the Eastern Front. Even localized attacks can be a pretty fierce affair and pretty traumatic,
Right.
for those on the receiving side. But they are localized, and they are focused on taking out German corps or army commands. Crucially, Army Oberkommando 4, which is the biggest formation dead in the center, just outside Moscow, is not even touched for the first week.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got an anchor holding everything nicely in place. And when you compare the ferocity or the intensity of these early attacks, December 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and I dare say even 12th, to other instances of Soviet counterattacks, like those around Smolensk and throughout much of August 1941, or in Ukraine, Dnipropetrovsk, that frankly, this is small potatoes.
Right.
And the Germans are inclined to be philosophical about it. Why? Because they've already made a decision to give up all the gains made in this continuation of Typhoon. Every single square mile which they have gained since mid-November 1941, they are getting ready to abandon when the Russians attack.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I would put to you, that's why the emergency doesn't really get through.
Right.
You can literally visualize people like Keitel or Jodl at Führer's headquarters who are at a fair old distance from a particular corps getting hammered to bits, saying, well, that's the particular sector we're going to give up by next Wednesday anyway.
Right.
And that's why they're inclined to be philosophical. They're also inclined, Halder and Brauchitsch, the Army Chief of Staff and the Army Commander-in-Chief, are not exactly engaged in a conspiracy of silence on the subject, but they're not overly inclined to pass on the unvarnished truth either, because this last ditch, this late autumn campaign to make it to Moscow was very much their baby, their idea, and Hitler went along with it very reluctantly.
Right.
And as they gradually realized that Soviet counterattacks are, shall we say, gathering of a certain momentum,
Mm-hmm.
and as they realized that if these guys keep this up for another 2 or 3 days, we might be in serious doo-doo, they're not exactly inclined to tell the boss.
Right. They're not coming to Hitler with their hair on fire and saying, we have a big problem.
Yeah, they're not exactly looking forward to having this particular conversation.
Right.
And that's why they feel, well, give it another day. And this last ditch Soviet attempt to expend every ounce of energy will eventually run out. They will run out of steam. They can't keep this up.
Right. Right.
It's simply not possible.
They're just throwing everything they've got at it, and
and by the time you get to December 13th, 14th, however, the panic drops. The situation has become, too dramatic. The front really is creaking in a number of places, and Hitler is sending out his OKW ADC to Army Group Center to basically do a bit of a personal recce and to talk to the Army and Corps commanders in person. And that's essentially when the proverbial hits the shit. He has quite rightly reached the conclusion that he has been had, that that these two gentlemen, or Halder or Brauchitsch, in particular, can't be trusted.
Right. Yeah. It's one of the things that the generals who survived the war after the war said about Hitler was that he was always interfering and whatnot. He was just a corporal. He didn't really understand military matters from a professional point of view, etc. But actually, like you said, it was not his idea to
it wasn't
to do another drive. Like he was perfectly happy with just parking outside Moscow for the winter and then resuming operations, presumably when the weather got better, in the spring. And it's kind of true, like you said, that he wasn't exactly given the full picture.
No, almost certainly not. Don't get me wrong. If you narrow it down to particular issues, I will always struggle to prove it. Why? Because the talks at Führer's headquarters at the time were not yet taken down by stenographers. That comes later in 1942. But still, we have a pretty good paper trail for a number of things that happened around that time.
Right.
And you can't but feel that, he was let down. He was let down. It's just that people like Franz Halder were in a position of, Franz Halder in particular, because the Americans found him in a concentration camp, and if you were one of Hitler's chief sidekicks, the one place you really want to be in when the victors arrive is a German concentration camp.
Right.
You're proof positive that you deep down you were always one of the goodies. Yeah. You were always one of the good guys. Right. It's just that you somehow struggle to articulate it.
Yeah. It's a communication issue.
Yeah, you said it. It's a communication issue.
Right.
But in fact, it chimes with what Roland Töppel discovered for the France 1940 campaign, when in his edition of the Manstein Diaries, that as far as being absolutely obstructionist to getting the job done, both Brauchitsch and Halder should really have both been sacked by June 1940.
Long before.
Long before this issue comes along. And even now, he eventually will sack Brauchitsch in a converse after a shouting match, which I really would pay serious money to
have been a fly on the wall.
To be a fly on the wall, because I'm convinced he brought up the subject of the declaration of war on the United States of America.
Interesting. Yeah.
As if you idiot had just opened your mouth 2 days sooner.
Right.
We would be in a totally different situation. I'm convinced a phrase like that was flung at Brauchitsch. But even so, he decided to hang on to Halder, which is interesting. He feels he needs these people because he does not yet have generals who are as experienced at this particular trait, and by the same token, zealous National Socialists as well.
Right. Yeah. So it's fascinating because, like I said, it's really just it's a matter of a few days difference, right?
We're talking 5 to 6 days. Yes.
Yeah, which is incredible. You write in the book that Hitler probably realized the full extent of Army Group Center's vulnerability on the 14th. So this is already 3 days too late, so to speak. And the crisis comes to a head maybe a couple of days after that, around the 17th.
Yeah.
Now, of course, eventually the front does hold, right? So there's maybe a tendency, kind of in retrospect, to think, well, it was probably not such a big deal. But in fact, there was a real threat of the German front being completely unhinged.
I seriously doubt the Soviets had the potential to do that.
Okay.
Don't get me wrong. Around December 31st and January 1st, 1942, it really, really, really looks like exactly that might happen. But it's also one of the reasons why the Soviet offensive is ultimately blocked, because they try to do too much. Long before they had the tools or the skills to pull off something like this. If, on the other hand, they had concentrated on breaking up one particular German army command, one that was a little bit more exposed, they probably could have done it. And that in itself would have been an important victory for the Allied side at this particular juncture.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, but I hope we've been able to give the audience a sense of all the different aspects and all the different things that were going on at the time that you described so wonderfully in your book. There are many other things we could have talked about. There's like I said, very interesting chapter on rubber. There's one on Hitler's physical health, the extent to which that may have played a role. The crisis in aircraft manufacture that was also going on at the time. So there were a lot of balls in the air. But your book really gives a rounded portrait of this incredibly important turning point, and as I said at the beginning, tries to take Hitler seriously, and tries to examine his decision making in light of the information that was available to him at the time, in light of his calculus, as he could try to make sense of things in December 1941.
Yeah.
The book, I want to remind the audience, the book is Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation, Why Germany Declared War on the United States. It's out in paperback with Cambridge University Press. Wonderful edition. Klaus, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Please go out and buy it in large numbers.
Absolutely. Get it. Family and friends. This is the perfect time.